In December 1441, a 19-year-old woman named Margaret Paston was staying with her mother-in-law here in Norfolk.
Her young husband was away in London, and she wrote to ask him to buy her a new girdle, a decorated belt to wear over her gown. She said ruefully that she'd grown so shapely that only one of the girdles she already owned would still fit round her. But there was a good reason for her changing shape. She was 6 months pregnant with her first baby.
And that meant Margaret, like all other expectant mothers in the medieval world, was about to face the greatest danger she would probably ever encounter. She knew she'd need help in facing it, but the help she'd need wasn't the presence of doctors, it was the presence of God.
They say the past is another country. They do things differently there. But just how differently did the medieval world approach life's great rites of passage? Birth, marriage, and death.
The way we handle these fundamental moments of transition in our lives reveals a lot about how we think and what we believe in. For the people of the Middle Ages, this life mattered, but the next one mattered more. Heaven and hell were real places, and the teachings of the Catholic Church shaped thoughts and beliefs across the whole of Western Europe. But by the end of the Middle Ages, the Church would find itself in the grip of momentous change, and the rituals of birth, marriage, and death would never be quite the same again. For medieval women approaching the moment of labour and birth, like 19-year-old Margaret Paston, there were no antiseptics to ward off infection or anaesthetics to deal with pain. And male doctors were not allowed into the female space of the birthing room. What Margaret knew was that the pains of labour were the penalty for the original sin of humankind. So to get through them, she needed the help of the saints and the blessing of God himself. So what was the medieval way of birth? Margaret was a member of the Paston family. They came from Paston village, and by the 15th century they had estates across northeastern Norfolk, as well as a fine townhouse in Norwich.
And they lived in one of the richest and most cosmopolitan parts of the country. Norwich was late medieval England's second city. But they weren't aristocrats. They were as ordinary or extraordinary as any other well-to-do family. But what makes them unique, and why we know so much about them, is that we still have their letters.
It's a remarkable stroke of luck that we have them, because almost no private letters survive from this period. Most of the Paston letters have ended up here in the British Library, and they form the earliest great collection of private correspondence in the English language. More than 1,000 documents survive, spanning 3 generations of the family. We don't know what the Pastons looked like, and most of the houses they lived in are long gone. But thanks to their letters, we can still hear their voices. I've been working on the letters for 25 years, but because they've been in print for a long time, I very rarely get to see the real thing. So this is thrilling, because the Pastons feel like my medieval family. And that's because these letters give us glimpses of a human experience that speaks across the centuries. Today, birth is openly discussed. We go to classes to prepare for it. It's debated in the media, and childbirth even appears on television as entertainment. But in the Middle Ages, birth was a much more private experience. So we're very lucky to have one surviving letter in which Margaret Paston talks about her first pregnancy. Margaret wrote this letter at the point when her pregnancy was becoming public knowledge. She was getting so big, which is why she needed a new girdle, that she couldn't keep the news secret any longer. "I may no longer live by my craft," she says. "I am discovered of all men that see me." By now, of course, her pregnancy was completely certain, but it wouldn't have been for some time. There were no pregnancy tests, so women had to rely on physical symptoms, which would then be confirmed by the quickening, the point at about 4 months, when a mother could feel the baby moving in the womb for the first time. Margaret clearly wants her husband home with her. "You have left me such a remembrance," she says, "that makes me to think upon you both day and night when I would sleep." Anyone who's ever been pregnant will know that feeling all too well.
But that's all we know. There are no other details in the letters, literally nothing, to tell us what her experience of labour and delivery were. And that's because in medieval England, the process of birth was hidden behind closed doors. The experience of this fundamental rite of passage was very rarely written into the historical record. So to get a glimpse of this hidden history, to open the door into the medieval birth chamber, we have to piece together fragmentary clues. And we can start with one small group of women whose experience of birth has left its mark in the pages of history. Royal women. Because when a queen gives birth, it isn't just a personal matter, it's a matter of national importance. After all, a royal baby might grow up to rule the country. And the significance of a royal birth was never greater than when a dynasty hung in the balance. In 1485, after years of civil war in England known as the Wars of the Roses, Henry VII had won the crown and married Elizabeth of York. But to ensure a peaceful future, they needed a baby, an heir. So now, at the age of just 20, Elizabeth was pregnant for the first time. And the future of this brand new dynasty rested on her shoulders. Everyone, king, queen, and country, was well aware of the significance of this imminent birth. 3 weeks earlier, Elizabeth and Henry had moved their court to Winchester, the ancient capital of England, which was thought to be the site of Camelot, the legendary court of the heroic King Arthur. And it was the birth of a new royal Arthur for which England was now waiting. Just before the baby was due, an elaborate service was held here in the ancient cathedral. This was the ritual through which the church asked God's blessing on a woman approaching her confinement. And Elizabeth, like Margaret Paston half a century earlier, knew that God's help would be vital for the ordeal that lay ahead. Because no matter how powerful you were in life, birth in the Middle Ages was a dangerous business. Elizabeth was led in a magnificent procession to attend Mass here in the cathedral, surrounded by the lords and ladies of the court. And then, with the prayers of the assembled company ringing in her ears, she withdrew into her inner chamber, and the curtain was drawn across the door. The next time she emerged, if she survived, she would be a mother. These days, if we talk about a confinement, we mean the actual process of childbirth. For a medieval woman like Elizabeth, its meaning was much more literal. A few weeks before the birth was expected to take place, Elizabeth took to her chamber. From this point onward, tradition dictated that she would be attended only by women, because men were banned from the birthing room. The inner chamber was smothered in tapestries, and only one window was left accessible to let in a sliver of light. Letting in too much light, it was believed, might damage the baby or strain the eyes of the labouring mother. The tapestries were richly patterned, but they didn't depict dramatic scenes which might upset a woman in labour. As one contemporary said,
imagery is not convenient about women in such case. The floor was laid over and over with carpets, and the effect was to make the whole room almost womb-like, dark, warm, quiet, and enclosed. But all the comforts a royal treasury could provide couldn't protect Elizabeth from the dangers of childbirth, so she'd need spiritual comfort too. Holy relics stood ready on an altar to bring the protection of the saints for what she now had to face. At this point in contemporary accounts of Elizabeth's labour, the doors of the birthing chamber are firmly closed. The next we hear is that at about 1 in the morning on the 20th of September 1486, Elizabeth of York gave birth to a boy, the first Tudor heir. And this baby, born in Camelot, was named Arthur. And with the birth of this little boy came the birth of a dynasty, one of the most famous in English history, the Tudors. The royal couple had invoked God's help before and during the delivery, but the Church's influence on birth began much earlier, before the baby had even been conceived. For rich and poor, the great and the humble, the Church shaped ideas not just about birth, but about how birth came about. And that meant sex, and the workings of the female body. And there were two women who dominated the Church's teaching on the subject of birth: Mary, the Virgin Mother of Christ, and Eve, the mother of mankind, who was most definitely not a virgin. This divided image of womanhood had a huge impact on the way medieval people understood the process of birth. And the Church's teaching was communicated not just through the sermons people heard in church every Sunday, but through the pictures they saw on church walls all around them. Once, every medieval church was covered in paintings designed to help people understand their faith. Now this church, St Agatha's at Easby in Yorkshire, is a rare survivor. This 13th century painting depicts the Old Testament story of creation, which was crucial to the Church's attitude to birth, because birth could only ever follow sex, and sex was tainted by the fall. Everyone knew the story of Eve. She was created out of Adam's rib to be his companion, but when she gave in to the serpent and took the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, she caused the fall from the Garden of Eden and brought shame to mankind. So women, the daughters of Eve, were weak in the face of temptation and driven by unruly sexual appetites. As the disapproving angel in this painting makes clear, they were a constant threat to the higher spiritual values of men. There were some in the Church who saw godly sex in marriage as a joyous thing, but many saw it as a necessary evil. All believed it should be confined to marriage and intended for the purpose of procreation. And the Church could be very prescriptive when it came to restraining this most basic of human urges. If we put together all the various rules in early medieval penitentials, handbooks for priests taking confession, people would have found themselves forbidden to have sex during Lent, Advent, Whitsun Week and Easter Week, on feast days and fast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays, or on their wedding night. And you couldn't have sex during pregnancy, menstruation or breastfeeding, during daylight, if you were naked, or, perhaps easier to follow this one, if you were in church. But there were ways in which the Church's teaching on sex potentially had a more positive impact. It was believed that men and women both had to produce seed in order to conceive. So godly sex, for the purpose of procreation, meant that women needed to have an orgasm. It seems unlikely that anyone ever actually followed the Church's detailed prescriptions about sex to the letter. But what's certain is that women continued to get pregnant. And when they did, the Church told them to expect a world of pain. In the book of Genesis, God thundered at Eve, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children."
In other words, the risks and the pains of pregnancy and birth were direct consequences of the fall, and all women inherited this burden of shame. So, while children might be a blessing, the physical process of pregnancy and birth was one of suffering caused by sin. That knowledge can't have helped Margaret Paston's nerves as she waited to deliver her first child. But would she find any more help in the medical world? Oxford has been a university town since the Middle Ages, but back then all academic study was pursued within the cloistered world of the church. So the people who studied medicine were themselves clerics. So at the heart of the medical understanding of conception, pregnancy and birth was a deep irony. These ideas were the preserve of men who, in theory at least, were celibate and would never themselves father children. But that didn't mean they weren't fascinated by reproduction. Medieval scholars produced over 150 texts on the subject of gynaikeia, the Greek word for women's matters. The basis for many of these was a text which became known as the Trotula. It was a text which was supposed, uniquely, to have been written in part by a female healer in 12th century Italy. And it combines folkloric remedies with a more academic understanding of birth. Many English versions of the Trotula texts were made in the Middle Ages, and this brilliant manuscript is one of them, now kept here in the Royal College of Surgeons. Some of the chapters deal generally with women's health, but some relate specifically to conception and birth, including this one about an art that's been lost to modern science, how to choose the sex of your baby. If she desire to have a man-child, they must take the womb of a hare and dry it, powder it, and drink it with wine. If the woman desire to have a maid-child, let her dry the stones of a hare, the testicles, and do the same thing. I'm not entirely sure this would work, but at least wine was involved. So, thanks to texts like the Trotula, among academics at least, there was a received wisdom about conception and childbirth. And it's possible to get a sense of that from an encyclopedia that was compiled in the 13th century by a friar named Bartholomeus Anglicus, Bartholomew of England. He started his career here in Oxford before travelling to Europe, where he wrote his encyclopedia. It still serves as a wonderful handbook of medieval thought. So he says in his chapter on babies, "The little child is conceived and bred of seeds with contrary qualities, and he is fed and nourished in the mother's womb with blood menstrual. Of so vile matter and unstable, man taketh his nourishing and feeding from the beginning." Men like Bartholomew were relying on the most authoritative medical texts available, but they were based on very little contact with women and very little real understanding of how women's bodies worked. And that male perspective on medieval women is revealed in an amazing manuscript known as the Welcome Apocalypse. I went to see it at the Wellcome Collection in London with the female expert on medieval medicine, Carol Rawcliffe.
15th century, and it's a sort of manual for life and death, because it takes you from the end of the world through how to die, through knowledge about the body, and then into vice and virtues.
And like Bartholomew, it has theology and medicine all in one package.
You can't separate them in this period. It's impossible to do that. Bearing in mind, of course, that many physicians are priests.
Am I right in thinking from all that that the right way to be was to be male?
Women are seen as rather botched and bungled versions of men from this standpoint. It's a very male one, you know.
Physically and intellectually.
Physically and intellectually, because they're not developing as well as men.
This is an extraordinary diagram of the female body. Could you just help me understand how it works?
Well, women are effectively men inside out. So their organs haven't developed outside their body. And so the vagina, which is here, is an inverted penis, and so on. And so you're really looking at a set of reproductive organs that haven't developed properly, that mark women as being inferior beings.
Those ovaries?
Those are the ovaries.
Which are presumably instead of testicles?
Yes, yes.
And there's a real sense, too, isn't there, that women are not only imperfect, but also unclean. Bartholomew refers to menstrual blood as vile matter, even though it's what the fetus is nourished by.
The idea evolves that women are poisonous or slightly toxic at this time. Her gaze, for example, can make fruit die, tarnish mirrors, and even killing children in cots, which, explains cot death. But this is coming to us from clergy. And, ordinary people who knocked around in ordinary life would not necessarily have ideas like this.
What happens then when we get to the point of birth? Because there's all this sophisticated analysis of anatomy, of conception, of how the whole thing works. Is the door of the birthing room shut to male physicians?
The actual hands-on business in the birth chamber was largely a female one, and it was a matter of decorum to leave it to women, because many of these people are priests, so it's not something that they should be dealing with.
Given the limitations of medical knowledge, and the fact that male doctors wouldn't even enter the birthing room, women were on their own when it came to giving birth. It was direct experience from within the delivery room, that shaped women's views of birth. And some of those experiences could be extreme and traumatic. One woman who knew that more than most was King Henry VII's mother, Margaret Beaufort. In 1455, Margaret Beaufort, heiress to a powerful Lancastrian dynasty, was married at the age of 12 to 26-year-old Edmund Tudor.
12 was the earliest age at which the church allowed girls to marry. But even then, it was considered young to be married in the fullest sense, so consummation was often put off for a couple of years to make sure the bride was physically ready. But Margaret was such a valuable heiress, and her husband so keen to secure his hold on her inheritance, that he made her pregnant straight away.
If being pregnant at 13 wasn't terrifying enough, 6 months into the pregnancy, her husband Edmund died of the plague, leaving Margaret a widow. When she went into labour, she wasn't yet 14. And as a contemporary pointed out, not a woman of great stature. She was so much smaller at that stage.
It was a traumatic delivery, but Margaret did give birth to a healthy boy, the future Henry VII. But despite 2 more marriages, she never conceived again. And it seems likely that this labour, at such a young age, left her irreparably damaged.
40 years later, Margaret found herself in a position to influence the proposed marriage of her 9-year-old granddaughter to the 18-year-old King James IV of Scotland. Because of her own experience, Margaret argued against the match. Her views are made very clear in a letter by her son, Henry VII.
My mother is very much against this marriage. If the marriage were concluded, we should be obliged to send the princess directly to Scotland, in which case they fear the King of Scots would not wait, but injure her and endanger her health.
So who did women have to turn to in traumatic deliveries? Who was there to help them cope with even a straightforward birth? The answer was a woman with very particular skills: the midwife. There's a clue about how important the role of the midwife was to labouring women in Margaret Paston's letter to her husband.
It was a little unnerving that the local midwife had a chronically bad back. Elizabeth Peveril hath lain sick 15 or 16 weeks of the sciatica. But Margaret had been reassured by a message that she would nevertheless come hither when God sent time, even if she had to be pushed in a barrow.
So what might Elizabeth Peveril have done to help Margaret during her labour? This image from a 16th century manual for childbirth, called The Birth of Mankind, of course, shows what it calls the woman's stool, It's what we might call a birthing stool, used to help a woman deliver in the sometimes more comfortable upright position, rather than lying down. And in this one, the woman is supported from behind, in an embrace familiar to anyone who's attended an antenatal class. These are practical and helpful suggestions for a normal delivery. And in the Trotula manuscript in the Royal College of Surgeons, there are some other clues about what a midwife might do if the situation became more challenging.
There's a section concerning the delivery of the baby. Here, we have some wonderful pictures of the various ways the fetus might present, with instructions about what to do if it's in any of these rather acrobatic positions. Here, the baby's upside down as it should be, but its head is too much and too great so that it can't come out, in which case the text says the midwife should anoint her hand with butter or with oil and make the mouth of the privy members large and bring him out with her hand.
The manuscript makes it sound straightforward, but what would a modern midwife think? Jeanette Alate is a midwife and chair of De Partu, a group that studies the history of childbirth.
The placenta.
When you're reading about medieval midwives, is there a huge gulf separating your experience from theirs? Or do you feel there are common threads stretching over the centuries?
I think if I'm speaking to you now as a midwife, I can empathise and I can understand where the midwives are coming from when they describe births. And you know, basically, women still give birth the same way. So the mother would look to the midwife for direction, and she would be supported, obviously, by the other women that were there. And so that's the main thing, really, having confidence in birth and in the midwife. And that can be said today as well.
So the differences between then and now are perhaps more extreme in the medieval texts than they are in what the midwives were actually doing.
Yes, and I think if the midwives could have access to the medieval texts, they may disagree with a lot of what was in them. The images actually don't bear much of a resemblance on reality. The fetuses look like little adults, and they're in very roomy uteruses with very thin walls. So they're totally theoretical examples of what might happen, the positions they might get in, and also the descriptions of how to manage these fetuses in these difficult positions. Some of them are not actually very practical at all, and there is very little detailed instruction on how to actually do these things. It says that you can turn the baby around, push it up, move it around, and you speak to any midwife or obstetrician and they'll say it is not that easy. You know, in a baby at term there's very little room in the uterus, and it is a muscle, it's contracting all the time. You can't learn midwifery from books.
Midwives had practical experience. But in some difficult births, without the help of modern medicine, experience wouldn't be enough. Who else could save a labouring woman? Once again, the church stepped in, because God might help where man or woman couldn't. Here in Winchester College, there's a 12th century manuscript which records the miracles that were believed to have happened through the intervention of St. Thomas Becket. After his murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, Thomas rapidly became one of the most popular saints in England. He was called upon in all sorts of desperate situations. And this manuscript offers one of the rare moments where we actually catch a glimpse inside the medieval birthing room.
Here, at the beginning of the manuscript, is a beautiful illumination of the saint himself, Thomas Becket, and then page after page in Latin of miracles performed through his intervention. And the one we're looking for is here. It's a story told by a priest named Henricus, who came to Thomas's shrine at Canterbury. And there he told Brother William about a woman from his parish who'd had a difficult labour. Tellingly, we know the names of both the priests, but not the woman or the midwives who attended her. Henry explains that the baby's head didn't come out first. Instead, one arm emerged, and then it swelled up to the size of a man's leg, grossitudine gambae virilis. For a day and a night she laboured in great distress, but nothing the midwives could do made a difference. In despair, she began to make her will, and because her life was in danger, Henry the priest was called. Priests were literate and might have some medical knowledge, but in this case, all he could suggest was cutting off the baby's arm, until he remembered that he had some water, aqua, from the shrine of Thomas Becket. And as soon as the woman drank it, the arm disappeared back into the womb, and the baby began to turn. When the baby was finally born, it was already dead. But the mother's life was saved, and that, in a complex and dangerous birth like this one, was a miracle. So despite the fact the Church taught that childbirth should be painful to pay for Eve's sin, one powerful thing it could also do was bring comfort and hope into the delivery room. And that spiritual reassurance could even take the form of physical objects. In the Museum of London, there's a jet bowl, which is a remarkable survivor from the medieval labour room, and it fascinates archaeologist Roberta Gilchrist.
The material itself of jet was regarded by medieval people as holding special properties. One of the things that it could do was to ease a woman's pain in childbirth. And we know that this very, very special material wouldn't have been used for ordinary bowls. There's no way that this is tableware. Nothing else survives like this. But it was turned on a lathe like a piece of wood. So it's like a very similar to a wooden bowl. But the size of this and the way you can cup it in your hand suggests that this might have been used for even drinking from. And I think what we have here is a very special thing of an object that's used in childbirth, possibly from the kit of a midwife who would have travelled from birth to birth and would have used this in the birthing room to serve a liquid of some kind to the woman, and the liquid would take up the special powers of the jet, so she would ingest the jet, and this is believed to help her with the childbirth.
This is extraordinary then, because it's so hard to get inside the birthing room in the Middle Ages. Does this give us a sense of a wider range of practices that midwives would have employed?
Well, there are all sorts of things that are in organic materials that don't survive. So we know that they would have been using parchment amulets and girdles and placing them on the woman. They would have been chanting using special charms. They would have used other materials like amber and coral would also have been brought in. All of these were regarded as natural objects with special properties that could help people.
How would the Church have felt about a bowl like this? Would it have disapproved?
No, this is an interesting thing. This is what we call now natural magic, magic which draws on the properties of the natural world. And the Church wouldn't have disapproved of natural magic because it didn't draw on any demonic agency or intermediary agency. And so this would have been regarded as part of God's creation. God creates the universe, God creates animals and gemstones and rocks and minerals which are believed to have special properties. So it's absolutely consistent with the Church.
So a midwife, with the Church's blessing, might use a jet bowl to comfort a frightened woman in labour. And that woman would need as much comfort as she could find, because she would have no pain relief in childbirth, and the possibility of dying was very real. Perhaps these fears were preying on Margaret Paston's mind as she wrote to her husband, urging him to return from London to be by her side.
I pray you that you will wear the ring with the image of St. Margaret that I sent you for a remembrance till you come home. St. Margaret was not only her own namesake, but the patron saint of pregnant women and childbirth. We have no way of knowing what Margaret Paston had with her for comfort during her labour and birth, but it might have been something like this.
This is a rare and truly remarkable document. It's a real privilege to be looking at it. It's a 15th century prayer roll, and on it is a poem in French telling the story of St. Margaret. St. Margaret might seem like an odd choice for women in labour. She was a virgin martyr who died around the turn of the 4th century, but before her martyrdom she was swallowed by a dragon. Here he is in the poem. And she was then disgorged from the beast's belly when the crucifix she was holding got stuck in his throat. So the idea was that babies would be born as safely as St. Margaret had been delivered from the dragon's stomach. But the really moving thing about this roll is how fragile it is. And that's because it was made to be used as a birth girdle to be placed around a woman in labour. Who knows how many deliveries it's seen? But this roll brings us as close as we can get to the experience of medieval birth.
Whatever Margaret Paston did during her labour, it worked. She safely gave birth to a baby boy and named him John after his father. It might be easy now to dismiss the comfort of a prayer roll, a jet bowl, or water from a shrine as little more than superstition. But we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the effects of psychology on the physical process of birth. Lucy-Anne Ashdown spent years as a midwife specialising in home births and delivered hundreds of babies, one of them mine. She's now a priest in rural Wales, and this combined experience has given her a clear idea of how effective special objects can be during labour.
Birth is very powerful, and it feels as though it's a power outside yourself, but it's not in one way. You know, in one way it is, and in another way it isn't. And particularly, you know, in the West, we're used to having quite a lot of control over our lives, and things we don't understand tend to make us feel anxious.
So even if we're taking a very rational and scientific approach to this, there is a way in which faith could be very practically useful in overcoming fear.
Definitely. I mean, we know scientifically, if we're going to use scientific information, we know that fear is not good to have around in any high contact. I mean, although Michel Audin says at the very end, for the birthing itself, it's quite helpful because it helps the baby to come out. But essentially, it's not an emotion you want with any degree of power.
We also know that in medieval birthing rooms, there were quite often relics or other holy objects or prayer rolls.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think, I don't know, maybe the term would be a transitional object, I don't know, but, you know, you would have people who would, I remember there was one woman, her lounge wall had one side of it, the birthing pool would have been here and the wall would have been there, and it was covered in photographs and covered in kind of affirmations. So that's one aspect I've seen, and then people work quite hard at setting up the space. So it might be about the colour of the fabric, or candles, or familiar objects, or photographs of family. And then there would be perhaps more explicitly spiritual things, which might have mirrored, say, a rosary. So you might have women who've had a blessing way ceremony and been given beads by different members of women who've attended that. So those kind of symbols that are comforting, you don't necessarily understand the full impact of what that means for that person, but I think it does connect very much with what you were saying about the medieval practices.
Again, even if we're being quite sceptical of the faith behind all of that, still the placebo effect can be very powerful, can't it?
And I'm not sure I'm incredibly comfortable with the word placebo, because I think there's something perhaps slightly more subtle and deeper about that. Clearly in the medieval period, the kind of capriciousness of gods and demons and whatever was probably more present than it is in some ways now. But the fear would still be great now, so perhaps we'd focus it more around psychological elements. So I think there are connections that we've probably inadvertently were tapping into without knowing.
The presence of God and his saints was vital during the perils of labour, but they were still needed even after a successful delivery, because the dangers didn't stop. In a world with no defence against infection, the days and weeks after a birth could be a vulnerable time for both mother and baby. And one of the best ways to give thanks for a baby's arrival and to ask God for his continued protection was to go on pilgrimage. And one of the most important sites of pilgrimage in England was the shrine at Walsingham in Norfolk. It was a site particularly associated with childbirth because it contained a replica of the Holy House of Nazareth, where the angel Gabriel visited Mary to tell her she would give birth to the Son of God. And in January 1511, a very special pilgrim came here to thank God for the safe arrival of his son. For the young king Henry VIII, having a son and heir to continue the Tudor dynasty was an all-consuming ambition. And after 2 years of marriage, his wife Catherine of Aragon had given birth to a son on New Year's Day. Henry lost no time in setting out to Walsingham as a pilgrim.
Henry walked the last mile to the shrine barefoot. It's an extraordinary image, the great King Henry VIII making such a show of humbling himself. But it's a telling sign of just how dangerous and unpredictable childbirth could be.
Henry and Catherine knew that all too well, because they'd already lost one child, a stillborn daughter. But now Henry had a male heir. The Tudor dynasty was secure, and England erupted with joy at the news of the royal birth.
Henry was elated. When he arrived here at Walsingham, he kissed the holy relic of the Virgin's milk and made offerings at the shrine. And then he went back to London to celebrate with a lavish tournament where he jousted as Sir Loyalheart in front of his beloved wife, the mother of his son.
But even a king couldn't be sure of heaven's favour. The celebrations had come too soon, because 10 days later, tragedy struck. Henry and Catherine's longed-for baby was dead. The royal couple were heartbroken. The Queen, like a natural woman, said one chronicler, made much lamentation. The Church recommended patient submission to the workings of God's will. But this can have offered little comfort in the face of such loss. Though many babies died before, during, or after birth, the fact that it wasn't unusual didn't make their family's grief any less.
In 1454, Margaret Paston was pregnant for the 5th time. She wrote to her husband John about some errands he wanted done and asked him to buy her some dates and cinnamon. And she added, "I pray you, if you have another son, that you will let it be named Henry in remembrance of your brother Henry, a brother who died in childhood." Losses stayed with families, and losing babies, common though it might have been, was clearly not taken lightly.
Touching evidence of the traces of this grief has been found by Roberta Gilchrist during her work as an archaeologist.
You get infants buried in houses rather than on consecrated ground, and certainly one of those had a whelk shell and also a spindle whorl used for weaving buried with it.
So that suggests their parents really didn't want to let them go.
Well, you could interpret it in various ways. I think that it may have something to do with keeping an infant in the family, but you could also say these are very poor families who couldn't afford to pay the priest or pay a burial fee. It could be a combination of things. But the fact that these are very carefully prepared burials, one of them is sort of lying on its side in a sleeping position. They're not casual or heartless disposals. They're very, very careful constructions, and that could possibly, we could conjecture that these are mothers that want to keep their children close to them.
So despite the fact that losing children was such a common experience, it wasn't taken lightly at all.
No, it obviously had a huge emotional impact.
Roberta has also found cases where emotion might override the Church's teaching about the significance of the sacrament of baptism.
We have a number of burials excavated of women who died in childbirth, some of them with the fetus still intact. And although that's very upsetting for us to consider, the important thing there is that medieval people were actually going against church ordinances to do this. Because if a woman died with a child that had not been baptized, the convention was supposed to be that the child was removed from her womb because it couldn't be buried in consecrated ground because it hadn't been baptized. But clearly medieval people couldn't face that. And you know, the sort of sympathy for the mother and the child prevailed, and so they were certainly burying women and the child intact.
The medieval church taught that it was essential for a baby to be baptized before it died, because an unbaptized soul was barred from heaven. Today, we think of baptism as a chance to celebrate a new life and name the child. These were elements of a medieval baptism, but the main purpose was something quite different.
A newborn baby hadn't lived long enough to commit any sins of its own. But like all of humanity, it was born in a state of original sin. And baptism was the sacrament that removed that stain, bringing newborns into the Christian fold, and if the worst should happen, opening their way to heaven.
Normally, that holy ritual would be carried out by a priest. But of course, a priest was a man, and therefore barred from the birthing room. So, because death was never far from birth in the medieval world, the Church was forced to make one truly extraordinary concession to midwives. In an emergency, if a baby were dying in the delivery room, they could perform a baptism. It was the only time a woman could ever administer a sacrament. So, in extreme circumstances, a midwife could hold the power of eternal life in her hands. The 14th century cleric John Merck wrote a rhyming set of instructions for parish priests, which included a homily on how a midwife should christen a baby.
Though the child but half be born, head and neck and no more, bid her spare, never the later, to christen it and cast on water.
And he told them what they should do if more drastic action were needed.
And if the woman then die, teach the midwife that she high for to undo her with a knife, and for to save the child's life, and high that it christened be, for that is a deed of charity.
In other words, a midwife should perform what we would call a caesarean. Thankfully, given the lack of anaesthetics, only if the mother had already died. Even if the baby breathed for only a minute or two, it was enough time for a midwife to perform this vital sacrament and save the baby's immortal soul, if not its mortal life. Given how sacred this responsibility was, the Church needed to know that these women could be trusted with such power. And by the 16th century, midwives even had to be licensed by the Church. And the issue of good character still plays a part in the role of midwives today.
Women were given episcopal licences if they were going to be midwives, which is kind of an interesting connection for me, about what sort of character of person they were. And still now, when you qualify as a midwife, your midwifery lecturers and your clinical placement have to send a statement saying that you are of good character. So there's something there about the kind of person you are. But there was a more sinister edge, which was worrying about women in general, so fear of kind of female mystery and the power of birth. So, you know, would you, if a baby had died, you could be accused of infanticide. So there's something about that midwife being trusted to witness that. And then you might actually want to hand your baby over to the devil. So again, you need, you know, you might pray incantations over to, you know, to that effect. So you need, again, a woman of good character that can witness to the space being held, you know, in a Christian way.
In medieval England, from conception to labour to the celebration of a new life, the Catholic Church shaped the way birth was understood and the ritual that surrounded it. But suddenly, in England, the power of this church was broken. And this radical change in England's religious landscape would reach into the very heart of the birthing chamber. Ironically, it was a birth, or the lack of one, that helped to spark this reformation. The death of Henry VIII's son after his pilgrimage to Walsingham was just the first of many miscarriages and stillbirths that Henry and his Queen Catherine had to endure. They had one surviving daughter, but by 1527, Henry was convinced that the only way that he could continue the Tudor line was to divorce his aging wife Catherine and marry the woman who he believed could give him a son. But when the Pope refused to grant Henry a divorce, Henry chose to break from Rome and make himself head of the Church in England. As Henry's Reformation gathered pace, monasteries were destroyed, churches whitewashed, and altars and icons smashed. But the effects were also felt in the most private and intimate of life's rites of passage: birth. In the summer of 1535, Henry VIII's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, sent out his men to confiscate fraudulent and superstitious objects that monasteries exploited, he claimed, to extort money from gullible believers. Among them were the many relics, images, and holy objects that were lent out to give spiritual support and comfort to women in labour.
By the beginning of 1538, the dissolution of the monasteries was well underway, and on Cromwell's orders, their relics and images were stockpiled here in Chelsea, ready to be destroyed, including those taken from the shrine at Walsingham. Rumour had it they were still working miracles, even in storage.
The old beliefs about the ways in which the saints might protect women in childbirth hadn't vanished overnight. But suddenly the comforts they offered had been snatched from women's hands. Not only that, but the new church was soon telling midwives and the women they tended what they could and couldn't do. The reformist Bishop of Salisbury, railing against intolerable superstition and abominable idolatry, told midwives
to beware that they cause not the woman, being in travail, to make any foolish vow to go in pilgrimage to this image or that image after her deliverance.
A labouring woman could no longer wrap herself in a prayer roll or put her faith in water from a shrine. Instead, she was only to call on God for help. This religious upheaval had been driven by Henry's determination to marry Anne Boleyn. But she too failed to give him the son he longed for, and soon she lost her head. By 1537, Henry was married to his third wife, Jane Seymour. That autumn she was heavily pregnant, and as she went into confinement at Hampton Court, the task of producing a male heir fell to her.
The ritual of Jane's confinement was much like that of the queens who'd gone before her. She retreated to her rooms with great ceremony, surrounded by her women. But there were signs of the changes that were coming. Just outside her door, 3 royal physicians, Doctors Butt, Owen and Chamber, were standing by.
In time, male doctors would force their way into the female world of the delivery room. But Jane's physicians were still outside. Medical science had yet to replace the spiritual comforts that the Reformation had done its best to do away with.
Jane went into labour on the 9th of October 1537. 2 exhausting days later, her baby was still not born. At last, at 2 in the morning on Friday the 12th of October, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son. Letters had already, optimistically, been prepared, in which the Queen announced that, by the inestimable goodness and grace of Almighty God, we be delivered of a prince. 3 days later, Jane was well enough to sit in state with Henry at her side, as her son was carried here to Hampton Court's Chapel Royal for his magnificent christening. The prince was named Edward, and 3 days after that he was proclaimed Prince of Wales and Duke of Cornwall, the traditional titles for the heir to the English throne. It had taken Henry 28 years and 3 wives, but at last he had his heir. But the cost was high. He had swept away the Church of Rome from medieval England, and the mother of his son would pay the ultimate price. As the celebrations at the royal birth continued, Jane herself was ailing. A week and a half after the birth, Thomas Cromwell was told there is no likelihood of her life. Jane died on the 24th of October 1537. She was 28 years old, and she'd survived the birth of her first and only child by just 12 days. Cromwell blamed those who had cared for her. They had suffered her to take great cold, he said, and to eat things that her fantasy in sickness called for. It seems more likely now that she had developed septicemia or suffered a fatal hemorrhage. The truth of the matter was that although the religious comforts that accompanied a medieval birth might be stripped from the labour room, the reason why they were there in the first place couldn't be so easily removed. As Jane's death proved, whatever ritual surrounded it, birth was still a very dangerous business. Henry remained in mourning for 3 months, until the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin Mary. But it was the sorrows of Eve, the dangers that faced women who couldn't expect a miraculous birth, that had taken his wife from him. For a queen as much as a peasant, no matter what the doctors knew, and no matter what ritual the church prescribed, the experience of childbirth remained eternally unpredictable. The scientific revolution that would transform our understanding of the process of birth and replace God with science was still more than a century away. But the medieval way of birth, with the comfort of relics and the help of the saints, was gone forever. The Reformation had reached right into this most domestic and secret of life's rituals. Next time, I'll be looking at life's next great rite of passage, marriage. In the medieval world, you could get married in a pub or even a hedgerow. But the church tried hard to impose order on this matrimonial free-for-all. So how far did it get in controlling those most unpredictable of human emotions? Love and lust.